Great to be here with you. Wherever you are, I take a moment to acknowledge that the land you're on, whether treaty or unceded territory, is worthy of your acknowledgement in the spirit of reconciliation. Thanks for coming on today. We spend so much of our time in the corporate world that we sometimes forget about how big and important the nonprofit sector is in Canada. And I'm going to talk about that. That's my passion. Those of you who have been on screen with me before may know that my cat Grace tends to make an appearance. She loves Zoom, has never met a meeting she didn't be part of. So if she comes up, we're just going to carry on, and she'll enjoy it from the comfort of my shoulder. So, nonprofit, what does it mean? The term nonprofit was the term for the longest time, but it confused people. It spoke to the nature and structure of a corporation, but a lot of directors mistakenly thought it meant that they couldn't make a profit. So someone introduced the term not-for-profit, which speaks more clearly as to the nature or intention of the corporation, but directors still get confused. So I use the term nonprofit and not-for-profit interchangeably, although there has been a shift recently where some, we'll do more on that later, but suffice for this session, I use them interchangeably. So what's the difference between a not-for-profit and a business corporation? Well, the two pieces of legislation, so the Canada Business Corporations Act as compared to the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. Not-for-profits are often exempt from paying corporate taxes, but not entirely, but usually. Nonprofits can conduct the same kinds of business activities as the business corporations, and importantly, they can make a profit. Instead of shareholders, nonprofits have members, and the organization, if it achieves a surplus, has to reinvest it in the organization and not pay dividends out to the shareholders. And importantly, the directors in nonprofits have the same standards as those in business corporations. Now, this didn't always used to be the case, but it certainly is now, and that's why a chat like this is really important. So nonprofits, corporations without share capital, they are a separate legal person. When we have meetings of the board, but not the corporation. And the board has the power, as in a company, to manage the affairs of the corporation. Now, on the topic of profitability, members and directors do not benefit personally. So those profits or surpluses accrue to the association or to the nonprofit. We'll talk about the number of kinds of nonprofits there are, but certain types, like professional associations, need a lot of money to put into reserves. And so you want to make sure that you're flush, that the organization is flush. So the types of nonprofits, these are some of them. We have industry and trade associations, and that's where members are typically businesses that share a specific activity and a common interest. So associations of manufacturers of common products or providers of common services. Professional associations are where members are typically individuals who share a specific vocation. So societies of accountants, lawyers, association executives, chartered governance professionals. Commercial associations, the members are businesses of diverse activities who share common interests. So we would put chambers of commerce in there, boards of trade, tourism associations, So diverse businesses with the same interest. A special association, again, typically an organization that share a special interest, like an association of municipalities or of universities. Now, common interests are typically individuals with diverse vocations and a common interest. So environmental groups, cultural groups, auto clubs, skidoo associations. And then there are registered charities. And these are organizations that are eligible for tax exemption under the Income Tax Act. And they're registered as charitable by the Canada Revenue Agency. So that's where you get your foundations, your associations that seek to cure diseases or advance religion or education, alleviate poverty and suffering. And so some of the other five, you know, the industry, the professional, commercial, special, or common interest could also be registered as registered charities, but they are not necessarily so. And so when people are thinking of getting involved with a nonprofit, whether it's on the board or as an employee or something is happening in your kid's school, you want to take into account the scope of the nonprofit. Is it national in scope? Is it regional? Is it provincial? Is it local? International? So there's just a lot of meat to all the types of things that are nonprofits. And we have nonprofits in our lives, literally from cradle to grave. So if you were born in a hospital, that hospital is very likely a nonprofit. You went to school and your school board was a nonprofit. You played in sports and your hockey club was a nonprofit. And frankly, when you die, your funeral is regulated by a nonprofit. So we really can't get away with them, so it's great to talk about them. And the value that all of these kinds of associations bring to our communities, to our nation, they can be about advocacy or lobbying, training or education, licensing, certification, regulation, codes and standards. They could be about networking or communication or research or publications. They could be raising money to eradicate bad things in the world, and maybe they're just a forum to discuss common problems. And so that's why there are so many of them out there. So to get an idea of just how big this is in Canada, 85,000 registered charities and over 170,000 nonprofits registered federally in Canada. Now remember, each province and territory has its own sort of Societies Act or legislation for groups that register strictly provincially or regionally. The economic impact in the sector, 169.2 billion or 8.5% of GDP. I mean, that's a significant chunk of change. So the business nonprofit institutions are about 10.5% of all the nonprofits in Canada, whereas the government nonprofit ones like hospitals and such, schools, universities are creeping up on 3/4 of all of them. Importantly, in not-for-profits, is the volunteer engine. I mean, you do need paid leadership to make these things function and function well, but the volunteer engine that keeps them going is really critical. The organization could never afford to pay the people what the volunteers do for free. So we have about 13 million people volunteering in Canada and averaging 28 hours a year. And we know averages are just that. Some people are way more, and some might just be a 3-hour bingo, but they all count. So it's roughly 1/5. Well, you can see the GDP numbers that volunteering contributes to in the slide. About 1 in 10 Canadians is employed in the sector as well. And interestingly, women represent about 77% of the workforce in nonprofits. So that gives you an idea of the scope of what we're talking with. Now let's get into the stuff that I wish people knew. So I kind of led you on the first one, profitability and nonprofits. A nonprofit needs to be profitable. We've established that members and directors don't benefit personally, directors are not paid, and the surplus accrues to the organization to reinvest in carrying out the mission. And if you're a professional association, for example, where you need public protection as part of your mandate, you're a regulator, for example, professional engineers, you need a lot of reserve funds to defend the right to title, to discipline members. There's a lot of legal wranglings in several types of nonprofits. So you need to make money. But if I had $1 for every board I heard of a nonprofit saying, when we do our budget, we need it to equal 0 because we're nonprofit, then they're doing a real disservice to their organization. Now, the tricky part here is that if you're also a charity, charities like to see your budget add up to 0. So you kind of need to do 2 budgets, one that shows really an equivalent inflow and outflow of cash. But generally, if you don't have that charitable status, you should always be budgeting for at least a modest surplus. And absolutely resist the temptation to refund, rebate, or repay. If you're a member organization, don't pay people back. So I remember years ago in the province of Alberta, Premier Ralph Klein decided that the province had enough money, price of oil was good, and everybody was going to get a check for $400. And we did. And I immediately spent it on diamond earrings, and so did my mother, because if you're stupid enough to give me money back, I'm going to be stupid enough to buy something stupid with it. So don't refund, reinvest in the work of the organization, make some money, and then put it to good and better and best use. The second thing, I wish directors knew what governance meant. If you talk to a new board member on the street, obviously somebody who hasn't gone through the Directors Education Accreditation Program or for the Institute of Corporate Directors or one of the others, if it's just Joe Schmo off the street, what does governance mean? They'll tell you it means you run a meeting using Robert's Rules of Order, and that is just not what governance is at all. Now, there are lots of kind of definitions of governance, but the origin of it is from the Latin expression gubernare, which means to steer. And so governance refers to steering or directing and controlling a group of people or a state. Like that's in your CGIC course materials. So you know that. From the 92 Cadbury report, you've heard that corporate governance is the system by which companies are directed and controlled. And that still holds true largely. But it's than that. And so the definition I like to use that's on your screen comes from a colleague, Doug McNamara at Banff Executive Leadership. And it really speaks to the complexity of governance and what it is that you and I, all of us on this call, are trying to do for our organizations. So it's a combination of stuff, policies, systems, and structures in a framework that the governing body, that's the board, puts in place to ensure leadership, that's the management, makes appropriate decisions and takes appropriate actions to deliver on your mission, on your mandate in an effective and accountable manner. So it's this whole big thing, and it's a closed loop. And so when I say governance, I'm talking big. I'm not talking just about board meetings. And governance really is the board's job. And yes, you will focus on planning and control, but also we need the board to make sense out of a few things. So what isn't governance? It's not getting involved in the day-to-day management of the operations. You hire managers to direct the business operations, but you're not managing it yourself. We'll speak about Richard Chait, who is kind of the nonprofit world's governance guru these days, and we'll dig a little deeper into what Chait says about governance. So the next thing I wish directors understood was their duty as a director. Now, this is just as true in the corporate sector, and it's probably my number one issue there as well. The word fiduciary, here's another one. If you ask the person on the street what's a fiduciary, they usually tell you, it means knowing how to read financial statements. And that's not it. That is a very skinny piece of it. So fiduciary is a person in a position of trust. So anybody on the board is a fiduciary, and so is the CEO for that matter. And the 4 principles of fiduciary duty are to act honestly and in good faith, be loyal to and act in the best interests of the corporation, avoid conflict of interest, and subordinate every personal interest to those of the corporation. It's not an either or. You don't just pick one. You need to do all those 4 things to be exercising your fiduciary duty. And you also have a duty of care, which is to behave as a reasonably prudent person would behave in similar circumstances. These are not optional. These are in common law. You might see them in your articles of incorporation. You might see them in your bylaws. You might have policies that write them in. And that's fine because it reinforces the message. But the fact is, because it's in common law, you don't really have an option not to do this, not to do these things. And yet, I guarantee everybody on this call has experienced a board where it looked like they honestly didn't know this or didn't get it or didn't agree with it or thought they had an option. I would have to say that condominium boards are probably the worst for not getting or not paying attention to the fiduciary duty. Very self-serving, in it for one issue, and make life difficult until it's either resolved or not. So, but this is true of every board, of every company, and every nonprofit in Canada. So if you only take away one thing today, let it be this page. But don't just take this and split. Let's see what else we've got today. So those board responsibilities, this graphic is from Richard Chait, who, as I said, he's kind of the governance guru, and his book, Governance as Leadership, he talks about high-performing boards and their 3 sort of areas of responsibility. So the fiduciary, he uses the word not great, but it's okay. He's famous and rich now, so we're going to allow it. But it really is the legal aspect of governance, the control piece. If governance is about directing and controlling, then this is the control piece. This is how are we going to do what we're going to do. So that's where you find your assets, your operations, results, resources, stewardship. You'll be having policies and board decisions around those things. Another part that Chait says is about strategy. That's the direction piece. If boards are direction and control, the strategic is the direction thing. That answers the question, what are we going to do? And so that's horizon scanning, your comparative advantage, and creating your strategic plan. So those 2 are really underpin everything. Chait takes it further than the Cadbury report or anybody who's done anything since then. And he says that boards also have a generative responsibility. And that is making sense of things, asking the question, why are we going to do what we're going to do? So if the fiduciary legal says, how are we going to do it? And the strategic says, what are we going to do? The generative says, why do we want to do it at all? And so it causes boards to look at their values, to really be clear on what matters most to them. What does it mean to the organization? And so you're framing the right issues in the right way. And I do get a lot of resistance from boards when I'm consulting with them. They like to check the boxes that come with direction and control. Did we do this? Did we do this? Yes, yes, yes. What they don't like to do as much, most of them, is to puzzle over a problem or an issue that will actually would help the organization more. I think, and Chait believes that by doing just the direction and control piece, we're not tapping into the big, beautiful brains of the people that we have around the table. And that's where the generative conversations happen. And so the recommendation from him is to always have time at a board meeting early when people are fresh to talk about something bigger. It's 10 years from now, looking back, what do we wish we had the courage to do today? Do we have the right mix of innovation and tradition? These kind of conversations are so cool. And if you start them early in a board meeting, your board meeting, I promise, gets better and more effective, but people do resist it because it's not as easy to do as to check a box. They really have to engage, but it's worth it. So the fourth thing I wish directors knew kind of comes on the tail of that fiduciary responsibility, or at least there's a bit of an overlap there. And it has to do with privacy, confidentiality, and conflict of interest. What can we talk about out in the world? You know, I want to talk about the organization whose board I'm on. What can I say? But, you know, there are a lot of privacy pieces of privacy legislation now that tell us we need to be careful about this. So I tell boards, assume everything you read or hear while you're sitting on a board, assume it's confidential. And the privacy stuff, especially the laws, keep those in mind when you're conducting your work. I feel quite strongly that most organizations, when they want you to talk about something on their behalf, they will actually give you the words to use to talk about it. So if nobody's given you words to use after your board meeting, then you probably should shut up. So conflict of interest, of course, that is one of the pieces of one of the four pieces of the fiduciary duty. So conflict of interest comes about if you have a pecuniary or a direct and personal interest in a matter. You could benefit, or someone in your family could benefit, or your company could benefit. So it's really important that every board have a policy on how it's going to handle conflict of interest. So you set that policy and then you darn well follow it. Because with conflict of interest, perception can be reality. So you may not think you're in a conflict, but if others perceive you are, it's going to cause things to go haywire anyway. So the process I recommend is declare it. You're in the board meeting and you think this item is coming up. I may stand to gain. I declare the conflict of interest. Then what you need, pardon me, what you need to do is to get out of the room and let the board decide if you do. In the old days, at least in the nonprofit world, you could stay in the room, you could talk about it. The only thing you couldn't do is vote about it. That's not on anymore. declare, get the heck out, let the board decide if you do or don't. If the board says you do, then you stay out of the room until they call you back because they've dealt with the matter. If you don't, they will, if you're lucky, remember to bring you in from the hallway, bring you back into the meeting, say, we've decided you don't, at least not at this point, have the discussion and the vote and record it. And you need to record the corporate secretaries of you out there. If you're also the minute taker, you need to make sure that every step of that conflict of interest process is recorded in the minutes. This is the paper trail that, well, I mean, all your minutes are compellable, but this is a paper trail that people are looking for and care about. So, so what happens if you don't have a conflict of interest, but you think somebody else at the table does? Well, as a director, you have a duty, it's still part of your fiduciary, even if you're not in conflict, to call it out. Now, you don't have to be a jerk about it, but probably through the chair, say, before we carry on, excuse me, I wonder if so-and-so has a conflict of interest. And you don't necessarily have to say why, but you might want to explain it. And then let the board decide. The person may want to speak on their own behalf, but then they need to get out of the room and the policy kicks into place again. The declaration or the accusation is too strong, but the entertaining the possibility. They do or they don't. The decision is made and it's recorded. And the person who's the subject of that discussion never votes. So there are a lot of policy templates out there on conflict of interest. Some of them are multiple pages long, but the fact is these few points are really all you need to be effective and to be sort of complying with the fiduciary duty. And another principle of the nonprofit world, and it couldn't survive without it, is the principle of one voice once a decision has been made. So hopefully you have a board chair who can facilitate good conversation, respectful debate. But if you oppose something, you voted against it. If that motion goes through, the decision has been made, you are obligated as a director to speak as though it was unanimous. And this is something that in board work over the years, this comes up whenever there is dissent. You do have a right to dissent, but you still need to speak with one voice once the decision is made. And if you really can't, if it is your hill to die on, then the right thing to do would be to leave that board. This is not the right board for you at this time. Without that one voice thing, the whole system falls apart. So we know this isn't true in for example, municipal politics or provincial, where everybody can see how everybody voted and you're kind of a representative. And I will talk about that in a moment. But I will say that conflict of interest has many faces, whether it's about financial gain or a family member gaining or a board member's pet project who keeps hijacking your already approved strategic plan and budget, like they just won't leave it alone. The board that contributes money to a public official in exchange for favors, confidential information from an organization to benefit somebody else's organization. Heck, I've even seen sabotaging the CEO in order to get the CEO's job. So countless examples of how conflict of interest might appear in a board exist out there. So be on guard for it. The fifth thing I wish people really understood on the nonprofit side is the importance of participation and the impact of not being present or not engaging sufficiently. Now, a corporate director gets paid. So they have, even if they're not particularly engaged, they kind of have an incentive to show up and hopefully to do the work as well. On the nonprofit side, it has to be, a person needs a compelling reason within them to not miss and to participate and be engaged. And if you don't, it really does hurt the organization. Participation also brings the opportunity to ask really good questions, not just the generative ones that I mentioned, but our questions around process and policies. Are we doing the right thing? I was in a governance committee meeting yesterday for a group, and we were doing a policy review, as wonks like to do. And it said an annual strategic planning retreat will be held before the AGM each year. Well, that's not very helpful. This is questioning a process and a policy. I get the intent, I get what they were going for, but technically there's 364 days to the next AGM. And so what is it you're really trying to accomplish? So it's okay to question those kinds of things and make them make sense for who's coming after you. You need to be around the table or on the Zoom screen. So that's the present. The participating is part of it, but holding each other accountable. You know, if somebody on your screen never says anything, yes, the chair should probably draw them out, but you know, find out, hold each other accountable, share the load, share the responsibility. It's really important that a board take time at least yearly to blue sky. If you'd be shocked how many organizations don't have a strategic plan and never have in their 50 or 60 years. But from time to time, they will blue sky. And if you do have a strategic plan, bless your heart, and make sure at least annually you're checking in on it to see your progress. Now, personally, I won't let a board have an agenda that isn't tied directly to the strategic plan. But you'd be amazed how many board agendas are just a template that have been going on for years and have nothing to do really with their mission and what it is they hope to accomplish. So take some time to think about the future, and if you can, build it into your regular meetings to be forward-looking. Way less looking backwards on reports of what's already happened and way more looking forward. Think about all the decisions you make at the board as how it's going to impact first the mandate, the mission of the organization. But also think about the impact on the bottom line, and in the nonprofit world, absolutely think about the capacity of the organization to implement this decision that you're making as a board member. Do we have the resources? Do we have the staff? Who needs it? Who's it going to impact? And quite often in the nonprofit world, what the board has to do then, if they decide this new thing is really important, they have to make a hard decision on what we're not going to do if we're going to do that. And that's an act of courage for a board. You can't just keep piling it on to the CEO or executive director. And of course, behavior and attitude are a big piece of good, fulsome participation in a board. So by behavior and attitude, I mean, do you respond promptly to requests? Silence is not consent. And so if I'm sending an email to a board, I don't care if it's a one-word answer, yes, no, got it, fine. But when I don't hear from you at all, I can't assume that's consent. So it's polite to respond, let's call it that. In your debates and discussions, be kind, at least be civil. But if you can manage kindness, that just makes everything better. If you can't say something positive about something, maybe don't say it. I believe Bambi's mother taught us all of that, and it really is as good advice today as it was when I was 5 years old. If you can't say it in the meeting, again, this is a big behavior thing for boards, don't say it at all. Like, don't say it in the parking lot or the elevator or scream it into your pillow when you get home. Say it in the room where you can hold each other accountable, or don't bother with it at all. And really, it's hoped that with good behavior and attitude, that you develop a trust with each other. And trust comes easier when you have good policies and processes. But I tell you, I'm getting really tired of writing policies and processes for when board members screw up. I'd just really rather you did what was expected of you the first time, and less of arbitration and mediation, or finding a way to kick you off the board. Yeah, so develop trust, have good policies and processes, don't let things fester. Also, part of participation, I mentioned, be careful about privacy and confidentiality. You are not the spokesperson for the organization. The chair might be the spokesperson for the board, and the CEO is the spokesperson for the organization. But just by being on the board, you are not that person, but you are seen to be connected to the organization. So it's really important that you walk the talk and reflect the values and the mission of the organization, and certainly in public promote the organization to others. So I am interested to know if there was stuff you wish you knew. So what the 5 we've covered today: nonprofits should be profitable, what governance really means and how big it is, the duties of directors, including direction, control, and sense making, and especially those 4 things tied to the fiduciary duty, plus the duty of care, privacy, confidentiality, conflict of interest, and one voice. Those principles, it would be great if people knew, and people understanding their own value, and come prepared and participate in the meetings and reflect a positive attitude for the organization. There are lots of other things I wish people knew before they got on a nonprofit board. I wish they were all in on the mission and understood its mandate, that they supported having productive meetings. Another thing, if I was going to do 5A and 5B, it would be that whole thing about whether you're a representative, in terms of a membership organization, representative of versus representative for. Now, there's this fellow in the States, Glenn Tecker, of the Tecker Institute. He's been consulting in the governance world in nonprofits and professions for, well, I'm over 30 years in, and he was there long before I got there. But when I talked about sort of city councils and how the voting lines up, I'm just going to give you some of Glenn's words. So representative for, so directors who think they're a representative for someone see themselves as elected representatives of a constituency. And so they voice only the self-interests and the opinions of that consistency and vote for constituency interests. I am really not a fan of that, even in politics. Now, representative of, so directors who view their roles as representatives of ensure that views, beliefs, values, and self-interests of constituencies they know the best are at the table as part of the conversation. So they voice interests and opinions of those they know best and vote on behalf of the best interests of the organization. So you can see the fiduciary responsibility really underpins that. So in terms of your participation, be more representative of instead of representative for, and then you would have a better chance of fulfilling your duties as a director. I've talked a bit about agenda structure and how that can help you. And so in that respect, I wish boards understood they don't have to follow the same old template. They should follow something that mirrors their plan and actually helps the organization move forward. So hopefully you'll tell me some things you wish you knew, and I'll carry on. So this is from one of my books that I published through the Canadian Society of Association Executives, but the copyright has since returned to me. And sort of the highlights on being an exceptional nonprofit board member is, have a common mission and shared values and pull the same direction and definitely obey the laws. Understand what you do for whom and frankly, why you do it. Get a good GM or CEO or executive director. Monitor your resources, improve your programs, and manage your risks. If you're in the corporate world, this is probably also sounding pretty good to you too. Work well with other people. Don't bring your personal agendas to the table. Be an advocate for the organization. You do have a duty of loyalty and support those board decisions. That's the one voice thing. Address conflict and face your problems early. Give your time, talent, and money if you can, and help others do the same on behalf of the organization. When there's a board vacancy, fill it with the right people. Put some rigor into your nominating process. In the flyer for this session, we talked about the warm body thing, and mercifully that has changed in the sector, but really be intentional about putting the right people on the board. Have a succession plan, and if you're, and not just for your CEO, but within your board and the officers, and if you're one of those good directors, consider putting yourself in the leadership chain, because all of these 180,000 plus organizations need good people leading them. Find support, encouragement, and people who want to work with you, and behave so that people would want to be on that board. So I really enjoyed, I was mentioning to Claire and Mike before the session, I really enjoyed the last webinar with Paula Connolly on mindful leadership. And what she did at the end was end it a bit early, leaving time for questions by saying, it's considerate of people's time, and it's better for you and healthier to have some breathing room before you rush off to your next meeting. So I'm going to stop talking. I'll take your questions, and hopefully you still have a little bit of time before you head to your next thing at the top of the hour. So thank you for your attention, and I'm here.
Does anyone have any questions for Linda? That was excellent presentation, Linda. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Hi, my name is Lydia. I placed a question in the chat for Linda, but I sent it directly to her. I'm not sure she can have a look. Thank you.
Let me see. Are the slides available afterwards? Well, I think the session is being recorded, and so in that respect, you'll be able to see them again.
No, it's the other question.
How do you continuously evaluate for fit? Is that in terms of recruiting new directors?
Both existent and recruiting. So you always want to be sure you have a group of directors you can choose from, but that those that are on the board, that they remain, honest to the fit and proper requirements.
Yeah, and the second part of your question is a governing code for disciplining directors, including removing them from the board. So Well, let's start by saying it's much better if you find the fit before they get on the board. Because none of us like surprises.
I
But
know.
what you need is for your bylaws to allow for the board to set policy around removal of a director. So you don't want a lot of detail in your bylaws other than an enabling clause that said for, conduct on becoming or missed board meetings, the board may choose to interpret that as a resignation, or in any event, however you word it, it would be at the board's discretion. And I can tell you, this has been one of my soapboxes, Lydia and crew. Like I said, I've spent a lot of years writing a lot of policies on how to discipline board members, and they almost never get used because boards don't have the courage to enforce the policies that they write. They write them in response to a problem, and then don't have the courage to do it anyway. So I'm tired of it. But I think there are policy templates out there that can help you with this. But man, I would rather put my energy into getting the right fit at the outset. And if you've been in any of my other sessions, this is going to sound super rude, but I'll take my chances. On some boards, especially if your bylaws are really loose and not reflecting best practices, sometimes you just have to wait for some people to die before you can fix it. And I have had boards where we literally had to outlive people in order to get the changes made. So I'm not sure, Lydia.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. I agree with the fit and proper beforehand, but unfortunately we don't always do that.
Well, I think my email is on that slide. So if you have a particular bear that you need to wrestle and you want to email me, you can certainly fire off a note, and I will try to give you some additional insight if I can.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Well, Linda, I don't know if you can hear me. It's Garnet.
Hi, Garnet.
Hi, how are you? Yeah,
I'm okay.
good. Two things I struggle with when I involved in nonprofits are, one is I think you covered it very well, is you got to think a little bit about innovation and think a bit versus the tradition. What are some things that you've seen boards do to maybe get on the agenda, the innovation side of it, and or forcing the staff to be a little more innovative in maybe their processes to save some money or to do things slicker and thing? Is it just talking about strategy or the big ideas, or how have you handled that sort of thing to get innovation more on the table than tradition?
Well, one of the groups that I had the most fun with that question with was a seniors housing establishment owned by the Catholic Archdiocese.
Okay.
So you've got something super rich with tradition.
Yep.
And so, trying to pull them out of why we've always done things that way. And so I do find, and so innovation, a big innovation is board portals, how boards even get their information, how boards meet, how committees meet. Those are innovative. So technology can certainly help with innovation, but in terms of a mindset, all you really need to do is add a 21-year-old to any board, and you're going to be forced into it.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I actually suggested that to a board recently to get some young people on this board. Yeah. Yeah,
no, and they will, God, they bring so much value. But the old guard, like me, can find it pretty frustrating, but they absolutely need to be listened to because they're going to show us stuff that we just never imagined.
Yeah. And my second, it's really, it was a good comment that I'm going to really think about. And the second one is, do you find circumstances where you get a really good board member, they're adding value, but they hit the term limit and there's just no options to keep them on? And because your bylaws or your policies say, yeah, it's 6 years, you're out. And are there innovative ways to keep somebody like that on? Or do you agree that we should keep somebody like that on? Or I'm going through that circumstance right now with somebody that really does add a lot of value, but their term's up, and I hate to see them go, but the rules are the rules, right? So
Yeah.
how do you do that?
So so I'm a big fan. I write a lot of bylaws, and I'm a complete bylaws nerd. I love them. So I'm emphatic about term limits. I'm also emphatic about a clause that says when you've hit your limit, you need to take a year off,
So you're off.
and then you can run for one more term, whatever that term is, whether it's 1, 2, or 3 years. But that year cooling off period, and most of us can find a way to keep somebody engaged for a year.
Okay.
And it, in my experience, it's either been the governance committee, so make sure, or the audit committee, the FRMA, make sure your bylaws allow you to write committee terms of reference that allow for people who are not on the board.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah.
Or if that director who is now set to rotate off for at least a year, if they had anything to do with your CEO compensation and review, then that committee. But I wouldn't put somebody who didn't have that experience onto that committee. But I do think governance, or else if you have project stuff, you could put them on a staff committee. Boy, that would be item 10 of things I wish nonprofit board members knew. These are the committees of the board, versus the staff could have as many committees as they want, because people like to do, right? So if it's plan the golf tournament and raise some money, put them there, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Have any other questions for Linda?
Yes, if I may, it's William Bastick. I actually have 2 quick questions. First of all, in terms of the duty of care, is the standard of care that is required of a director who is a qualified expert in a certain field? I'm thinking, for example, an engineer or a lawyer who serves on a volunteer board of directors. Do they not have a higher standard expected of them in terms of their duty of care?
Oh, thank you for the question. I didn't even plant you in the audience, but I would have if I'd thought about it. So in a case where there is that kind of person at the table, there actually is a higher duty of care, but only on items that relate to that expertise. So one of the flaws I see on nonprofit boards is if you've got that CPA or that lawyer, the other directors look to that person for expertise on everything. And that just ain't so. So there is a higher duty of care, but only on that narrow piece that you're qualified for.
Right. Okay. Thank you. The second question is in terms of getting, as you said, the right people to be on the board. My personal feelings, not to be associated with the Institute or any of their directors, officers, or employees or agents, so there's my disclaimer, is that somebody who comes on the board should have really 2 qualities. One, an interest in what the organization is and what it does. And secondly, some sort of capability of contributing some area of expertise or capability to that board, whether it be fundraising, finance, administration, technical, whatever it happens to be. And that the right person is not simply someone that happens to live in a certain area, is a friend of so-and-so, or happens to be browbeaten into the position by a board member who thinks that they would be a good fit and reluctantly gets dragged kicking and screaming onto the board.
100% agree. I didn't hear a question, but I absolutely agree with the statements.
I'm hoping to, if I may, show your video here to my board of directors on our health center, and that's exactly the issue I'd like to address. So, pardon the underhanded means, but hey, and thank you for your response.
My pleasure. Don't you love when a plan comes together that you didn't even make? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Have another question, William?
I'm sorry?
There's another question, I think, from William.
Hi, I guess it'll be me, right?
Yes, William.
Yeah, hi. Hello, Linda.
Hi there.
Thank you for your presentation, first of all. And I just have a question in slightly more detail then, because I've served on multiple boards before, and I've noticed some differences in terms of the chairmanship of boards, right? There are some chairs who are very engaged. They would touch base with board members individually before or after the board meetings. And there are some chairs who would resist doing that and say, hey, I let all discussion be held at the board. What would be your take on that? Which one would you think is more prevalent out here in Canada? Because I used to live overseas and I've seen some very intense, I don't know if it should be called lobbying of the chair for his position or whatever. So I don't know how, what kind of position most chairs in Canada are like. So could you share that? Thanks.
Thanks, William. I find, although I've worked with many excellent chairs over the years, most aren't savvy enough to handle the lobbying part, and that just takes me back to, well, why are you on this board? That's not, when you're lobbying the chair, that just sounds like a personal agenda to me, and I want to shut it down. So if I'm not chair, I'm going to talk to you about behavioral things offline, but mostly I want things for the whole board to learn and understand. Hearing the same thing at the same time is a really valuable tool. And that's why for onboarding and ongoing board development, I like even very experienced directors to hear the words at the same time new people do. So, this is 5.5 or 7 things that I wish board members knew when they got on, but we all know there's like 342 things that they need to know that we're not going to get to in an hour. And certainly chair competence and style would be another thing. But yeah, I think there are things offline, everything else with the board as a whole, and that director who keeps trying to get the ear of the chair, to me, is
Or the chair who is trying to get everybody, right? Or hurt all the directors. So I guess it's more preferable for the discussion to be held within the board meeting itself rather than before afterwards. Then it's better.
I always prefer to do board business with the whole board at the same time.
Yeah, understood. Thank you.